all for coming to us from Hamilton Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. It's a pleasure to welcome you here, and it is indeed my honor to introduce today's distinguished speaker and our former colleague, Dr. Shireen Hunter. Dr. Hunter is a veteran of Iran's Foreign Service, where she served for 14 years before the 1979 revolution. She then became program director at the Center for the Study of Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, and the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels before serving as senior visiting fellow, visiting professor, and research professor at ACMCU. In September 2019, it was our honor to appoint Dr. Hunter as ACMCU's first honorary fellow. Dr. Hunter is author of 16 books and monographs and editor of or contributor to 12 other books and monographs. Her latest books include God on Our Side, Religion and International Affairs, 2016, Iran Divided, The Historical Roots of Iranian Debates on Identity, Culture, and Governance, 2014, which was chosen as a Choice Outstanding Academic Title in 2015, Iran's Foreign Policy in the Post-Soviet Era, Resisting the New International Order, 2010, and Reformist Voices of Islam, Mediating Islam and Modernity, 2008. She has written more than 100 book chapters and journal articles and over 500 opinion pieces. She has lectured widely, participated in conferences in the United States, Europe, Russia, Middle East, Central Asia, and Africa. She is also a frequent contributor to U.S. and other media outlets. And please then help me welcome our distinguished speaker today, Dr. Shireen Hunter.
Thank you very much, Professor Sandra Tamara, for first of all hosting this event, but also for your more than generous introduction. As somebody said, he said that with that introductions, I can't wait to hear what I have to say. But I wouldn't let you, be misguided by Professor Sanz, as I say, more than generously. I also would like here to also thank John Hall, our former academic director, and also at one point director of the center. And just to want to say that how much I valued and enjoyed my association with the center. And also my collaboration with both Tamara and the professors. And you heard I edited a lot of books. And being an editor is a very thankless job. But I never had any problems with these two, that I had the honor of collaborating. So let me, first of all, this obviously, as people say, is a timely thing, but when I wrote this, it wasn't really with any eye to timeliness or think that people are going to, really buy it already. Of course, every author hopes that they will buy, although an academic book, given the kind of contracts that the publisher give you, it comes in drips and drabs, like you get $50, I don't know, if you get 100 or 200, you've been doing quite well. So I think the main purpose of this really was a couple of things. First of all, again, as I mentioned it in the preface to the book, that certainly since I became aware of international politics, and of course that was mostly when I started at the university in Tehran, there was some tensions between Iran and several Arab countries. Now, the tensions were not always across the board. In other words, Iran was never at loggerheads with all Arab states. But nevertheless, it was also never, smooth sailing for Iran when it came to relations with the Arab states. On the other hand, particularly when I went and worked in the United Nations, in the 70s and so on, prior to that, in my personal interactions, let's say with Arab diplomats or in other travels and so on, I had, very good relations with them. I will tell you an anecdote, and then we will. I remember when I was at UN at one time. Of course, Iran and Iraq. Those days, they sat next to one another, and this was a time that Iran-Iraq relations was Saddam was still in power, and Iran-Iraq relations were rather tense, and expectation probably was that Iranian and Iraqi diplomats should not talk to one another. But I remember there was a very nice Iraqi diplomat sitting next to me. And he said to me, those days, unfortunately, I was misguided and I used to smoke. So he offered me a cigarette and said to me, look, we are going to be sitting here at least for 2 months every day until the commission's work is completed. We either can be civil to one another and have a good relationship, or it's just look daggers at each other, and then we actually became almost friends. So there was none of those dynamics that was at the state level was, for instance, with that. Or when I was in Tehran, it was just after the Iran and Egypt, after the period of discord during the time of the presidency of Jamal Abdel Nasser, had established diplomatic relations. I became very close with several Egyptian diplomats. In fact, one of them named his daughter Shireen, and he claimed that it was because of me, but I'm sure it was some other. So what I'm trying to say is that at personal level of interaction with Arabs, I have never really felt this type of thing. So this was for me a very interesting thing to discover. Why is it that, what are the changes, metamorphosis that happens at interactions either at the group level or more importantly at the state level that causes these tensions and these problems. So this was really the main motivation behind writing this. But the other thing that was also important motivation was that since the Islamic Revolution and Iran, but increasingly I would say that after the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, most of the Arab-Iranian tensions has been attributed to sectarian factors or to ethnic and historical competition. Now, I am not a person that, I tell it the way I see it. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not good, but I say it. So I am not going to dismiss that these factors don't play any role whatsoever. Obviously, they have, and they have a kind of create a certain background that exacerbate other causes of conflict. But I have also seen that during all these times, there was never, that these factors never really determined. For example, now we are talking about how Saudi-Iranian relations have been difficult for a long time. But Saudi-Iranian relations were never completely free of tension or competition, because no state relationship, interstate relationship, is completely free of competition or tension. But the tensions were not such that prevented at least collaboration on certain areas and collaboration on specific issues that the two states has mutual interest in it. So that what I'm saying is that you cannot just also blame this on ethnic and sectarian relations. Again, I'm not dismissing it. Iran and the Arabs have interacted for at least for almost 3,000 years, but perhaps less. And so in this space of 3,000 years, one or the other must have done something that the other didn't like. I mean, but if you look at it, certain things, and certainly during the pre-Islamic era, actually Arabs were helpful to the Persians. I mean, Herodotus, for example, writes that Cambyses could not go to Egypt, conquer Egypt, if the Arabs did not ease his way. Or, for example, of course, I have to be very careful here if you have some friends from Lebanon or the Levant. Or, for example, Phoenicians, if you say they're ancestors of the Lebanese. Again, I don't like to get into, I'm not an ethnologist by any means, so I'm very, very conscious of my own limitations. So if anything I say that meets with some disapproval, I hope that you will be indulgent and so. But they built ships through the Persian army and so on and so forth. So I think that now, admittedly, the entry of Islam changed matters, and I don't want, because we don't have that much time to go into it. If somebody is interested to know how it turned things, I can go into that. But I want to more specifically get into the real factors, in my humble opinion, that is. So now, for a very long time, certainly after the Turkic conquest of the Islamic world, it began with the Mongols and then was continued until the Ottoman times, and it really didn't come to an end until the First World War and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. So the bilateral relations between Iran and the Arabs was very limited. I mean, at the state-to-state level, because they were all part of the Ottoman Empire. So Iran dealt with the Ottomans, and whatever tension was there was between the Ottoman and the Persians or Iranians, which I prefer Iranians because Persians just one group of Iranians. The thing is that we should really say that it was more, the reason also there was more imperial rivalries, because you have to understand that the mentality of empire, we tend these days to have a retrospective approach to history. In other words, we judge history according to the concepts of the 21st century, or at least the second half of the 20th century. The concept of nationalism as such, yes, of course, there was consciousness of ethnicity and so on, but the consciousness of nationalism as such did not exist within empires. They were people, and their loyalty was to the imperial power, or whatever that was. And then you had local identities and so on. So if you look at that history, you see that the Iranians and Arabs, they worked together, and a lot of interaction was that. You look, for example, particularly in the beginning of late 18th and early 19th century, a lot of Iranians were unfortunately very, very easy, keen to leave and go. I think that the minute there is a trouble, they leave and go. They don't. So whatever it was, so you see them everywhere, from Malaysia to Africa to Asia, and now America and Europe, and what have you, including yours truly. But of course, others was different. So I'm not trying to sort of blame others and say I'm different. So the point is, in Egypt, the number of Iranians and so on. I mean, I had some relatives, that my mother's uncle had settled there, and they married the descendant of an Iranian that had married into the family of Khabib and all kinds of things. So, in fact, the bazaar, the souk in Egypt that is close to the Masjid al-Wasai, they used to call it the Persian bazaar. But of course, so I'm just saying is that, so obviously if Arabs and Iranians were so at loggerheads, how could this community, for example, live and survive there, or in Iraq and back and forth and other things and so on. So I think that we do a lot of retrospective. So what has been the cause of Arab-Iranian tensions? I think that, let's say that since the emergence of independent Arab nation states. Well, the first thing I would go even beforehand, I think that the first impact was, in my opinion, the impact of modernization. Impact of modernization because the modernization in the Middle East, well, in some of the other countries and in the Middle East, was accompanied by a resurgence of nationalism. Why? Because modernity was imported from Europe. And of course, Europe of the 19th century was the hotbed of nationalism. And the nationalism there was not what we have come to talk, either civic nationalism, in other words, based on the concept of citizenship rather than ethnicity or other criteria, but it was on the, almost I would say, exaltation of race and at least ethnicity and the particular attributes of a particular race or tribe. And so, this was unfortunately going there, the results of it. So I think that this was also, important in that. In the book, I discuss it, of course, in this. I owe it to the Arab scholars who have written that, and I have basically read and benefited from their work. And of course, somebody said that if you don't quote the author, it is plagiarism. But if you quote it, it's research. But I mean, at the end of it, knowledge is cumulative. We all benefit from the work of one another. And the thing that happened is that the Arab world at that time also was trying to deal with the problem of colonialism, trying to find ways of basically liberating itself. And also it was trying to find a common sort of focus that could bring all this thing and harness it for anti-colonial struggle. And so I think, as some Arab scholars have said, the Arab nationalism that evolved became perhaps overly focused on ethnicity and on language and trying to bring all these things in a foundation of Arab nationalism, Arab unity. Now, that is a very good thing, because without unity they couldn't have achieved anything, which of course it was prevented, as we know it didn't happen. But on the other hand, if you become too intensely concerned with your own situation, then obviously the tendency to otherize other groups and so on, particularly if some people have been rivals at some point or whatever become. Unfortunately, simultaneously, we see this happening everywhere in the Middle East. Or, I mean, in Turkey, Ataturk is the epitome of a ethnocentric, and some people will say, maybe I should say that, extreme ethnocentrist nationalism. But in Iran also, you saw that this type of nationalism emerged, and certainly during the Pahlavi times, efforts to look back to the pre-Islamic Iran and the Aryan origins of Iran. Nothing has remained that, but still, there may be groups here and there. But so what I mean is that ultimately, then Ferdowsi became so, and then bemoaning Arab invasion and so. So I mean, what I would call is that rise of nationalism, ethnocentric nationalism, really created a condition that exacerbated some of the other conflictual things. So this is the. then obviously you had the problems of state building. I think that this state building problem was more acute in the Arab world because they had been longer, Ottoman control and whatever. And the problem of state building is also, some way, is otherization would happen. Now, the third thing, which I think was very significant, was the impact of revolutionary ideas. And this was not the fault of Arabs or the fault of Iranians or whatever. These were developments that going on, and so this seeped into whether it was socialist ideas or some kind of a hybrid, of these ideas. But I do believe that the problem, the issues of liberation, and was very important. And so we see that, for example, a lot of the revolutionary ideologies are adopted because they are seen as being more effective for this liberation, which I think even after so many years after the official end of colonialism, still is something that preoccupies people. And one of the problems that happens in this regard is that there was a significant time lag between what I call the Arab revolutionary wave, which was mostly in the 1950s and the 60s, and the Iranian revolutionary wave, which happened and is still unfortunately ongoing. So I think that it's a pity that initially Egypt and Iran, in the late 1949 and the early 1950s, there was talk of creating in the Egyptian-Iranian almost alliance. When Shah's particularly the late Shah married Princess Fauzia and so on. There was, in my opinion, I think that this was obviously a bit exaggerated, but the fact of the matter is that it wasn't even given a chance. So if Egypt and Iran had continued, let's say, on a more democratic and evolutionary way through the parliamentary thing, then maybe some of the problems that later occurred, it would not have occurred. But it didn't happen, and we had the Egyptian Revolution. And given the view of the Egyptian revolutionaries, in general, all the monarchic governments were viewed as corrupt, whether it was the Arab monarchies or, of course, the Shah, Iran. And so that this began to feed into a kind of a narrative of Iran as enemy of Arabs and so on and so forth, which unfortunately came from Egypt. And this, I was there and seeing that this happening. Then we had the Abbasids, not first Abbasids, first was the Abdul Karim Qasim revolution, which was much worse than the Egyptians, because my own experience have been that Egyptians, by and large, I think they are very, by and large, they are gentle people. Gentle people, you agree, no? Gentle people and civilized people. So they, even at the worst time of Nasser, this didn't really get too far. But what I'm saying is that at that time, there was no question of Sunni or Shia. Shah was a secular guy, so was Abdel Nasser. I mean, yes, he manipulated at some time, the Muslim Brotherhood or others, but he changed position depending what he saw as Egypt's interests or the government's interest. The same thing in Iraq. Now, I would say that in the case of Iraq, it was a little different. The reason being that Iran and Iraq have been very much, I know this sounds terrible, and please look this not from the current situation. Iran and Iraq have been very much close interacted for centuries, since the collapse of the Babylonian Empire. The Abbasid Empire was known as the Arabo-Persian Empire. There are many Iraqis of Iranian origin. There are probably many Iranians of Iraqi origin. So the question is that with Iraq, both animosity and friendship becomes more intense. The other thing is that they are neighbors. So what happens? In other words, both Iran and Iraq are part of each other's very close strategic environment. So neither Iraq nor Iran can be indifferent to what happens in those things. But here I would like to say, however, that the first shot in tensions between Iran and Iraq was done by the Iraqi revolutionary government of Qasim. In fact, Iran was one of the first countries that recognized the revolutionary government. But immediately after coming to power, Qasim started, resurrecting territorial claims to Khuzestan or they call Al-Ahwaz or whatever. And I know this because by then I was of age to at least read the papers. At least my mother used to read the papers, so it was inevitable that I would hear. And so that was it. And then later on, we thought that there would be a war because the Iraqis were preventing the ships coming through the Shatt al-Arab or Arab, as the Iranians call it. So what I mean is that in that sense, really, I would say that they were the ones that started it. But that was, again, I don't hold the Iraqi, I know this is cliche, people and governments are different, but there are at some level. It's the group dynamics, it's a state dynamic. Perfectly sane people, when they go in a group, whether it's a rock concert or a religious ceremony, they suddenly behave in ways that normally, if they saw themselves how they are behaving, later would say, gosh, was that me? Was I that? Doing those things. But the thing is that, yes, group dynamics is a very important thing to study in politics and in interstate relations. So what I'm trying to say is that that was the ideology. I would say the major source of Arab-Iranian difficulties has been differing ideologies at different times. Now, when after the Islamic Revolution, tables turned. Then it was Iran. Then it was Iran that calling everybody corrupt and illegitimate and everybody from Sadat to the kings and princes of the Persian Gulf. So, in a way, it is just so eerie, and it's almost, for me, it's almost so also exhausting, fatiguing, because you see, even studying, you see the same dynamics repeating themselves in a different guise. I mean, one thing that people don't quite understand is that how much the Iranian Islamists, particularly the left, which most of the problem in Iran, still, in my humble opinion, comes from the left. No, I am not a rightist in that sense, but the left has made tremendous damages for, it really has distorted the natural evolution of Middle Eastern society. Anyway, but the left, the hardliners are basically leftists. Why they love Russia so much? I mean, it's not just the geopolitics, they are left. And how much they had internalized the Arab left of the 60s and 70s. If you look at their talk and you just look beyond the Islamic, as one of them once called it, Islamic veneer. I mean, that is the same kind of thing. I remember, for example, when the Islamic Revolution talks about imperialism, international Zionism, and Arab reaction. Well, these are the three the evils that Nasser first used to say, and then everybody else said. So I think that we have to look at ideology very much. And of course, what really exacerbated this was the dynamics of the Cold War. Dynamics of the Cold War at one level exacerbated tensions. Because if, for example, Egypt under Nasser had not moved close to the Russians, the Shah would not become so apocalyptic about what Nasser was doing. he became obsessed with Nasser because Nasser was a charismatic figure. To be honest, even now, if I see some of his videos, it's difficult not to, be influenced to some extent. He was a charismatic figure. Everybody else today I see is just cannot compare to him. None of them could compare to him. So that is also was an element. But because Egypt was close to Russia, then of course, Egypt will be closer to Russia because Russia is miles away from Egypt, whereas, Europe is much closer or others are much closer, whereas in Iran, Russia is here. This is Iran, this is Russia. I mean, this was then Soviet Union. So it is obvious, but this dynamics of differing alliances exacerbated this. Arabs, for reasons that I am not coming to, some Arabs, not everybody, went towards Russia, and that created another line of division. But by the same token, Iran's relation with those Arab states who were in the pro-Western camp grew closer. For most of the 60s and until about early 70s, Saudi-Iranian relations, I think that would be more friendly than, definitely nothing as kind of intense that we have been witnessing in the last, as I say, in the last particularly 10 years, but since the 2003 Iraqi invasion. So this was another thing to say. There's also, before I move out of the colonial thing, there are some disputes in Iran's relations with some neighboring Arab states, which is basically only Iraq and Abu Dhabi. And these are the legacy of, and I say this how it is, it's the legacy of colonialism and the legacy of empires. Part of it has to do with the Ottoman Iranian thing. Iraq became a major area where they were. So, Basra was for a while part of Iran, then it will go somewhere else, the other thing will go here. So a lot of things are very indeterminate. But the most important problem was the question of navigation on the Shatt al-Arab and how to divide it. There's every thing is that the navigation of frontier thing, like the Shatt al-Arab, should be in accordance of the Talmudic. But the British, and those of you, I can't find it. If I could find it, I would read it to you. But the British did not agree to that. You know why at that time? And this is in the archives of the what used to call India office and so on. You see this because at that time Iraq was under the British protectorate. Iraq was British protectorate. And most of the ships that were navigating from Shatt al-Arab were British ships. So there, in this letter, the Lord of Admiralty says, although this division is against they called it the Persian government, but because of the interest of the British Empire, we have to do that. But this became then a major cause of tension, and still is there. Iran and under Saddam Hussein, they signed the Algiers Agreement and agreed on Talmudic, but after the Islamic Revolution and the war, then obviously this was nullified. Although that when in 91 he wanted to go to war, Saddam Hussein again reestablished that. But now this government that people say is under Iranian thumb refuses to honor and they don't even agree in cleaning the thing. So I'm just saying that a lot of things you read in the newspaper, it's a lot of stuff that is going on. The other problem, and then I will get to the last in 5 minutes, so we can have discussion or whatever you suggest that if I have time. The other issue that became a major cause of, again, this is another controversial thing, and I am honestly saying this without any particular view. It was the issue of Israel. It was the issue of Israel and the dynamics that this created. all I have to say that in the during the pre-revolutionary times, Iran had certainly, I would say that from mid-50s to until about 1967, people, again, this is another thing that people are a little bit not quite clear about it, had a close relationship with Israel, which obviously this caused Arabs resentment. And even inside Iran, a lot of people were against it. And it wasn't just the Muslim, oriented people, but nationalists and the left that had stronger anti-colonial and so on and so forth were against that. Whether it is justified their reasons or not, I'm not getting into that. But be that as it may, this close relationship was a major, major source of tension. After 1967, I think that Iran's assessment changed. In fact, Iran became somewhat frightened of how far Israel might go in terms of territorial expansion. And so from then on, Iran's position in the UN was always condemnation of the occupation of Arab lands, and was always the return of, and Iran's position was that, unlike what they called that, the Shah was a servant of Israel and so on. No, it was that these lands have to be returned to the Arabs. And in fact, by early 1970s, the Shah was trying to reach out to the Palestinians. And this one, I saw it myself when I was in the UN. PLO did not respond. I think part of that not responding was obviously you still had, certain radical Arab countries which wouldn't want that, like the Iraq and Syria at the time. But Iran even reached out to Syria. And, Assad visited Tehran in '75. And I would submit that that was part of the reason the Western attitude towards Iran began to change. From then on, Iran became the bête noire. Shah became this dangerous man who wants to dominate the Persian Gulf and all these kind of things. So I think that was, so this is a lot of the things you hear and is constantly repeated, partly because we have had now a overflow of opinion writers and so on who really don't know, and they just listen and then write the stuff. I don't want to get into that. Another thing is the Mossadegh myth, for example. I don't want to get into that either. But so what I'm trying to say, this whole question of Israel became a major irritant in Arab-Iranian relations. But now it is again irritant in Arab-Iranian relations, certainly with some of them, because of, again, timeline. After the Islamic Revolution, Iran became an ardent defender of the Palestinian cause, where everybody has basically, Arab world has turned more than accommodationist. And so again, I'm not saying which is good or bad. I mean, that's for people to decide, for government and on people to decide. But what I'm saying is that a lot of the thing that we are not saying to Iran is because of this, shall we say, uncompromising position. Some of it is really objectionable. I don't want to get into that, but they could have a much more balanced, position. For instance, accept a two-state solution and so on, rather than some of the, extreme position. Basically, go with the mainstream of Arab opinion and Arab position. Iran should follow Arabs in this regard and not try to lead but be that as it may, this was also a major factor of it. But I want also to come in, last but not least, there has been the evolution of the international politics. The evolution of international politics. For example, I would date the beginning of the, and of course there is the normal rivalry among states. I mean, Arab states compete with one another. Why should they compete with Iran? They compete with, I mean, that's a fact of interstate relation. But the point I'm trying to say is that this rivalry should be kept within acceptable limits and not to lead either to demonization of people or religions or whatever. But the other thing is the international politics and the great power politics. Um, Great power politics basically likes the smaller countries to be divided because that provides opportunity. This may be, some people might say I'm being controversial, but so be it. I mean, Arab-Iranian tensions has been very lucrative for arms. I mean, how much more, for example, a country like Qatar or Bahrain can buy arms. They can't use it. They don't have people to man those things. Or, for example, how much more? And in fact, if you look at the arms industry, the most flourishing export of the industrial countries is in the arms industry. Everybody is in it. Russians want to sell S2 thing. The other ones to want to say Patriot. Somebody, Chinese will come up with something, I'm sure. But how can you justify this? There is no Soviet Union. And this is the problem that happened when actually, again, time lag, when Iran was moving to be more moderate, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Soviet Union collapsed and altered all international calculations. One, there was need for a new enemy. So radical Islam or radical terrorism was one, and Iran was the other. And of course, the policy, again, I don't want to absolve Iranians of their own misdeeds. If I were Iranian leader, we wouldn't be in this shape. But I don't think I'm not by any means volunteering. Oh no, I am. I just don't have the stomach for politics. I really prefer, riot and do things. But the point is that if they had a more able, less revolutionary leadership, then of course they could have mitigated some of these problems. I mean, you can't call somebody, whatever it is, some Sunni extremists calling Shiites kafir, or some Iranian or Shia, I think, calling the others godless or whatever. You can't say these things and expect not to have ramifications. It has. We are people. We are made of flesh and blood. You get hurt, and I think even states get hurt. So other things, same thing. I mean, so I think there is a lot of hope in there after the revolutionary stuff that came. But I think international politics contributed to that. And one was making Iran the focus. The other thing was basically U.S. Went on what I call a transformative policy to reshape the Middle East, the world. The Clintons did it generally peacefully, but then we had 9/11, which was unfortunate, of course, tragic, but then that gave license for all kinds of things. And I think that the most significant element of increased tensions with the Iran and Arabs was the invasion of Iraq and the dynamics that it unleashed. One, it frightened, basically, it frightened a lot of Sunni Arab countries. And you don't have to be anti-Shia to be worried about the new front. That could be something else. Still, you would worry because if you, which I never thought it will happen because there are other dynamics besides religion that operates. But if Iran and Iraq could really become corroborative, it would be a absolutely humongous power. And so part of it was that they got frightened, and part of it, and that gave vent to certain language, which I frankly found difficult. I'm not going to repeat it. There's no use to do that. And on the other hand, of course, it also then changed at least the perception of balance of power in the region. You can't, you can't bust up a country like Iraq and think that there's not going to have any ramifications. And one, it created the power struggle inside Iraq for who is going to get it. The Baathists didn't completely disappear. Some people say that, the mastermind of Daesh was a Ba'athist officer. I don't know. I read it like everybody else. So, I mean, things don't just disappear. And so the continuation and even the latest, protests, yes, there's two layers. One layer is really legitimate grievances. I mean, a country that was invaded, then you had the civil war type thing, then you had Daesh. Well, it's obvious that economic development suffers. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure that out. And the other thing was, of course, regional rivalry for how to get that. And this, I think, that became worse. But the other thing was that, unfortunately, I think this is again documented. There's not a single thing in this book that is not documented. In all my books, there's nothing that it's so and so told me, or there's not everything is documented. And the other thing was the feeling that if we could exacerbate Arab-Iranian tensions and Sunni-Shia tensions, then the Arabs and Israel will make peace. And they are still trying to do that, and I would say that that will not happen. Because, you can't just dispose of, nobody else can dispose of the people. And even if you have a peace, it will be a very unstable peace. In all this equation, it seemed to me that the Palestinians were sort of absent. They were meeting, so-and-so was meeting with so-and-so, and all this time, the only element that was absent was the people who were supposed to make the peace. Are supposed to make the compromise, and of course, that doesn't work. So let me just wrap up what I have said, and then we have time enough for question, answer, and conversation. Certainly, in a long history that has been with Arab-Iranian relations, relations have developed in a very complex thing. It's a combination of attraction, a lot of attraction, certainly in Iran's case, because when you become a Muslim, up to a point you also become an Arab. It's very difficult. There was a famous saying when I was a child and so on, we say that in Iran, you say, how can I love an Arab since Muhammad is an Arab? So I think that element is there. This doesn't exist on the Arab part so much, but there are other attractions that they have. But there also, inevitably, you will have competition. Look at the English and the French. What do you think the Brexit is all about? The English, anyway, I don't want to get into that thing. So what I'm trying to get at is that Arab-Iranian competition, or maybe some misunderstanding, is nothing out of the ordinary. This is something exists, everywhere. So the question is that, do we try to diminish them, or we want to fan the flames, whether for specific purposes? And unfortunately, I have to say, that it has been, certainly in the last 10, 12, 15 years or so, has been almost a concerted effort to fan these flames in order to change this sport. And a lot of the stuff that is going on is not about Arab versus Iranian or Ajam or whatever. It's about commerce, money. Like I finish on this. After at one point, I read an article, it was in New York Times or some other paper, about this Iranian ice cream producer. Iranians have some nice ice cream that had become so popular in Iraq. And so this article was saying how dangerous is the Iranian ice cream is in Iraq. So, but really, it gets to this sort of thing. Maybe then selling, some Iranian might say that having what we used to call it, the baklava of Sham, the ones that are special, very nice thick ones, that is, undermining Iranian identity. Well, who knows? If you want to make things out of it. So yes, this sort of long history creates a background that if you manipulate it, creates elements that can be manipulated. that can be manipulated, and it has manipulated. Every time tensions rise, some of the extreme newspapers, like particularly in Kuwait and so on, like Al-Ra'y I think that is the really radical one, right? That Iran must realize the era of Khosrows has disappeared. I'm telling them that the Iranian regime thinks that the Khosrow was part of Jahiliyyah. They are more against Khosrow than Arabs are against Khosrow. But what I'm saying is that so there is stuff in the history that if you want to pick up. But on the other hand, there is a lot more of interpenetration of that if you can build on that. It all depends at which road you want to go. And so far, for international politics, it has been lucrative and it has been strategically useful to manipulate these tensions. You can create. Now I think that Turkey is joining the game. I think that I heard that the Egyptian foreign minister said that we have to now to prevent Turkey's nefarious activities. So in addition to Iran, now we have the Turkey's nefarious activities. Sorry I went on too long, but it was a long subject.
No, it was brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. I'm going to take Chair's prerogative and just ask the first two questions. One is just a clarification.
Yes.
I think that critical issue about the Colonial and Shah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that people understand what that is. If you could just clarify.
Well, it is the median line of the river. The median line of the river. Yeah.
And according to international law, in general, a border goes down to the deepest part.
That's right.
But there were manipulations of that issue during the period of Saddam.
Yes, well, but the point is that there are various arguments on that, and it is in here. And but to my mind, I think, again, please don't look at it as a typical Iranian-born person talking about the British. But most of these problems is really the legacy of the British manipulation, including the island things that I was much more closer involved. And again, here I have to say it was the failure of Iranian diplomacy. And this, I was at the foreign ministry. Iran had no claim, no problem with either Sharjah or I think it was Khomeini that is the other one. Iran's dispute was with the colonial power, with Britain. And the Shah was so stupid that accepted the compromise that Iran will occupy the island without the British saying one way or another. They could have said, this island belongs to Murkabe, so shut up. They could have, and the Shah couldn't have done anything. And my feeling is, again, I'm not suggesting that Bahrain should rejoin Iran and so on. That's another issue. But the Shah should never have agreed to referendum in Bahrain until the island issue was settled with Britain. But unfortunately, he had a lot of flaws, and one of them was that he was fearful of, particularly of Britain. I don't think that, the people talk about American influence. I think Britain still was more influential in Iran than America was. And a lot of, I don't want to turn this into an Iranian issue, but I think that all these things was really remnants of even early on, all these documents is in here. The British, at some point in the 19th century, because you have to remember, those were not the states still. There was various small chiefdoms, tribes basically, and that was the piracy coast that became the Trucial coast, because the British basically forced them to sign peace treaties and make themselves protectors. The British asked the Sheikh of Sharjah to hoist his flag, and because they knew that would get the Iranians vote and so on. But of course, Iran was at the time decadent and couldn't do anything. So I'm not saying that it's all Britain's fault, but the fact of divide and rule is a major thing. And I would say that unfortunately, the problem is when the colonial power leaves, it leaves even more problems. The problem, the competition between Iran and Saudi Arabia began when Britain said that they are leaving, the so-called East of Suez. the east of Suez, the Aden and withdrawal from Aden, which is now is being fought over by Abu Dhabi and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But then the Americans, they were still involved in the Vietnam War, and America was in no mood whatsoever to take on the responsibility for stability in the Persian Gulf. And so they pushed the Shah to do these things. They say Shah said, I am gendarme, and so the Shah couldn't say no. They would have gotten rid of him sooner. I mean, they did eventually, but they would have gotten rid of him sooner. And at that time, the Saudis refused. Shah made, in this one, I said, 2 suggestions for regional security, and was willing even to include Pakistan, so that the Persian Gulf Arab states will not feel that they will become under the thumb of Iran if they agree to this, but they refused. And this is all very well documented. And so this was another thing I wanted in this book to some extent, that because Iran had been a world empire, everything they do is viewed as another sign of imperial resurgence. And of course, some of them really shoot their mouth beyond what is necessary. And no, they do. I mean, I'd say that he became, to some extent, victim of his big mouth. The Iranians, including yours truly, we have a big mouth. We can't control our mouth, unfortunately. It's really true. It's true. No, we do. I mean, you have to be aware of your own flaws as well. And he constantly said that, he should have realized that neither Britain nor United States are not going to allow the so-called, he called it riparian states. In other words, the countries that are on the 2 sides of the Gulf, to run the security of that. The Persian Gulf is far too important for everybody to allow it, the locals. They're not going to allow it, and the Shah shouldn't have done it. On the other hand, also, you have to see Iran is larger. So, when Iraq still was there, and I still believe a 3-way balance is the best way for stability, Iraq and Saudi Arabia and the GCC and Iran, because then they can balance one another. But obviously Kuwait and the UAE and so on are not going to accept a security system that is dominated by Iran. And Iran, domination is not an act of will. It's also a function of physical strength. U.S., even if decided that it's not going to be active in international affairs, will have an influence because of its weight, economic, geographical, and others. So I'm just trying to say that the study of international relations should get out of the good and bad, good people versus bad people. It's not a question of good and bad. It's the nature of the beast. And there's so many people, unfortunately, talk about international affairs that don't know even the ABC of that. So this is what I'm saying. And even now, they won't allow, and Kuwait and Qatar and Oman and others would like to reach some kind of agreement with Iran. And I don't know now, because somebody mentioned that the Saudis and Iranians could perhaps talk to one another. Question is, will the Saudis be allowed to talk? Will the Saudis be? I mean, at one point they thought that, Americans will take care of Iran for us. Now it's become clear that taking care of Iran cannot be done on the cheap. In other words, it will cost, because it has to be done militarily. Unlike the Shah, these people go to the other extreme. They are not frightened. They are willing to push the envelope as far as they can go. And so, they will be a war. And in war, they are vulnerable as much as Iran. Iran may be annihilated, but others are not going to remain. So the question becomes, will this allow for some kind of regional discourse? And maybe even, Pakistan can be an added element, to introduce some balance. Saudis have good relations with Pakistan. Pakistan is a nuclear country, but They also have to be careful about Iran because of they have, I don't know, 30, 40 million Shiites among other things, and then there's the frontier and whatever. But they might act as a balancing, element, and eventually Iraq hopefully will recover and will resume its role. But I don't know whether international politics are going to allow it. Now Russians want to sell. Russians want to be present at the Persian Gulf security. They are pulling that. Unfortunately, I think Iranians are just not reading the international relations quite well. I think I'm very disappointed of the state of. So, sorry, Dan, I moved too far.
No, that was brilliant. I will forward my second question, Dr. Hall.
Yes.
Okay. You talk about the importance of the Persian Gulf and Shatalata and so on. One word that I didn't hear, and I hesitate to open up a whole new area, but the word is oil. Shatalata is important because the oil goes through it. Persian Gulf
Shatul Arab oil doesn't really that much go. Abadan, of course, is oil goes mostly to Park Island.
Now, the question that I have then is,
Yes.
is in terms of the relationship between, especially Iraq and Iran, in terms of their role as oil producers.
Yes.
Because one of the really interesting transformations of the last 50, 60, 70 years, starting with World War II, global oil was dominated by the Seven Sisters in
That's right.
1945. And now it's not.
That's right.
And
For a long time now.
and now we're going to have a privately stocked Aramco and so on. But what is the role of oil in all of these politics that you're talking
Well,
about?
the role of oil, I don't think it's so much in regional politics, at least not until quite recently, like until the middle of the 80s. In fact, oil in the 60s and even 70s was a engine of cooperation between Iran and Arab states. For instance, the creation of OPEC.
OPEC was joint.
Joint, absolutely. The Iran, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and I think Algeria, I don't know, but they were among the founding members of OPEC. And so that was, was a source of cooperation. It was after the Iranian Revolution, but also, frankly, again, impact of international politics. After the Western world turned against the Shah, Saudi Arabia used oil as a weapon against Iran. And this again this time I was fully adult. It was in 1976 when Yamani was very anti-Iran, personally very anti-Iran. And Yamani pushed
Minister of Oil Affairs.
Yes, pushed in fact, I was at the conference with him. He's a very urbane and gracious person, and so he pushed it. Saudis pushed the oil price to very low. I don't know, it's 76. What was it in the Bali conference? OPEC's Bali conference. That triggered a deep recession in Iran. And I think that that contributed greatly to the revolution because it extended unhappiness from just the hardcore Islamists and leftists to the broader population. Because you see, Iran had experienced almost 15 years of incredible growth. I mean, people don't understand. Iran was on what those days we used to call a takeoff level. Of course, the government in Iran now denies it, but that is what it was. Again, I don't know whether I should repeat it because this is not documented. I can never. It's among some Iranians it goes around. Apparently, reportedly at that time, Kissinger had said that we don't need another Japan in West Asia. So I think that there are a lot more to international politics than peace and stability. And so stability is not the ultimate goal. Stability is based on the balance of power that favors one side or the other. So anyway, these were very much mixed. But I think now with the oil in general abundant, obviously it can become a source of competition because both Iran and Iraq and others need oil to fuel their economies and so on. But to be honest, if I think that if most Iraqis are allowed to, I think that the Iran-Iraq cooperation can go on. And the reason why I'm saying this, although ethnic sectarian factors are not that dominant, but Shias of Iraq are a minority of the Arab world, and I don't have really a big history of friendship from them, So there is a natural gravitation, even though some of them might be more nationalist oriented. But I believe that even once they see it, they will realize it's not. The Kurds, particularly with what the Turks are doing, Kurds are Iranian people. I'm not saying they're Persian, but they're Iranian people. If you look at Kurdish language, it's closer to ancient Iranian Pahlavi than Israel. So Iran is the Kurds' natural ally. And this was demonstrated with the Daesh and so on. So you have a significant majority that will go there. And with Iran's anti-nationalist and Islamic discourse, some Sunnis also might prefer that. You see, if Iran was the nationalist and so on, inevitably you would reach the Iraqi and Arab nationalism. So it still is there. But those can be mitigated. So I think that there can be really fruitful cooperation. And to be honest, I believe that countries like Kuwait and Oman and Qatar, I'm not so sure whether it is now because they are bad relations with Saudi Arabia or it's more a strategic decision. But they would like to cooperate with Iran. There are large Iranian communities in these countries. The Iranian communities in Kuwait were there before al-Sabah arrived there. That is a fact. Or before al-Khalifa arrived in Bahrain. I remember once, this long story, I don't want to go to that question, but I was talking to a minister in Bahrain, this was a long time ago during the Iran-Iraq war, and he said to me, well, if things get bad, we will go back to Najd, where we came from. This is what, of course it was in private, you can't do. But what I'm saying is that the destinies of Iran and the other side of the north and south of Persian Gulf are very much, close together. Some of the southern parts of this were very much Arab influence. I mean, you can't separate them. It's just will be very, very wrenching. And so I think that, in my opinion, particularly now, a lot of it is what I call ambition, domination ambition. That I have to say. Both Iran wants leadership role. That I cannot deny that they want a leadership role. Not territorial expansion, but they want a leadership role. And Saudis want a leadership role. And they play on this. So that is purely, but even there you can have a sharing. I always say, and Obama said, he said, why don't they learn to share? But anyway, it's very complicated. Oil can be one way or another. Oil is not, it depends how you use it. If you use it as a weapon, then obviously it's cause of conflict. If you use it as an engine of growth and progress, then it can be. But I think the problem of oil now, in the age of climate change, is more existential. It supersedes this type of things. Yes, sir.
Thank you for the interesting talk. You mentioned Russia a couple of times.
Yes.
So it seems to be that Russia right now in a little bit better position than the United States in the Middle East because it talks with all major parties and there's different conflicts, right? Even within the Libyan civil war, it talks with everybody. Do you think Russia has the potential to breach this gap between Iran and the Arab states in the Middle East, or at least bring them closer?
I don't think so. I think Russia, well, to begin with, at the moment, I think the Arab states' flirtation with Russia, I would say, certainly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, is more function of their troubles with Iran. And so if there is anything, I think Iran will be the loser in this thing. The other thing is that Persian Gulf Arab states, certainly also Egypt and obviously Jordan and so on, they are still dependent on the West for their security. If they want to change that, here we have to take, again, since you mentioned Russia, I might as well mention Lenin. Every action has a reaction. So you can't. One of the things people don't understand, particularly people who do, video games and how a war is going to go and so on, they think that everything stands still. On a video game, the variables stand still, and then you can manipulate them. But in real life, if, for example, tomorrow Saudi Arabia goes without the American or whatever, unless America changes completely its strategy towards the Middle East and say, I don't want to have anything to do with the Middle East, I don't need it, that's a different story. But, excluding that option, if the Saudis or UAE and so on go too far towards, Russia and they buy S-400 instead of Patriot or some other American weapon system, Americans are not just going to put their hands, and sit silent. There will be some repercussions, obviously. But I agree with you that the United States, by not dealing with Iran, has limited its options. And of course, Iran has not been an easy not an easy interlocutor, to be honest with you. There are some group in Iran that they see their domestic interest in the perpetuation of this. And I don't think they have any, they don't seem to have any exit route for themselves. I don't happen to agree, but the fact is, if Iran talks to the US, it only will be useful if they have to change certain aspects of their foreign policy fundamentally. Then it's not going to go anywhere. And so I think that we have also, fairness. However, what I do criticize was that the nuclear deal, although it had tremendous opponents, and I have written this, both in Iran and in US, there were people who didn't want this to succeed. And so they did what they could to really, and in Iran too, but that could have offered. The problem in US-Iran relations has been that the United States has wanted Iran to make all the concessions up front. But they can't do that up front because, nobody can do that. Nobody can give up all their, assets in a negotiation up front. So, but unfortunately, Americans have not wanted a gradual movement. And in my other works, I have shown how they have not responded. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mehtat, for your lecture.
Thank you.
As you mentioned, I think that you have a lot of comments about the foreign policy of Islamic Republic of Iran. And for example, you said that Iran should talk with the USA, but for example, somebody like me, when I'm looking into the negotiation with the USA and we have a deal with USA, and you see about the fate of that deal, you know that America had a coup in Iran, they tried to support Iran in Iran, and on the other hand, a lot of Arab countries in Middle East just stick to America and push to America. For example, come to US, come to Middle East, please help me, we cannot protect themselves. I mean, yes, some Iranians have a big mouth, but in this situation in Middle East, with Israel, with Arab countries, with all this situation in Middle East, and with Trump and USA, and just USA tried to support,
I understand.
How Iran and which part of foreign policy of Islamic Republic in Iran Iran, and which part of our foreign policy should change?
Can I start by saying this? To begin with, Iran should stop the so-called anti-imperialism. The Islamic Republic is in dire need of a new discourse. I mean, when I just read the stuff that I read, the country is in a free fall, a complete free fall, in terms of not just economic and so on, the moral aspects of it. I mean, everything, and the Islamist discourse has really basically lost its appeal. I mean, you know, they are taking Iran back. The Iranian population, I mean, let's say I have been recently, there's some controversial thing I saw which was amazing. There was a poster, apparently, that was advertising polygamy. I mean, you know, the Iranian women are not educated and so on. And even, you know, you have the clergy are saying that the temporary marriage is a hidden form of prostitution. I mean, which is. And the temporary marriage was done for a wartime, in the time of the prophet or imams or whatever. So the point is, one, I'm just giving you the solution. Iran has a new discourse. This new discourse has to be centered around Iran. I'm not saying nationalism, because nationalism has connotations that can be, but on Iran's citizenship, on Iran's interests. What are Iran's interests? Iran's interest is to increase its security. Iran's revolutionary discourse has done nothing but decrease Iran's security. Now, I am not I was the one person during the Iran-Iraq war and later on that warned against Saddam Hussein. So I'm not a Saddam fan, you can assure that. But I can also not, and I think that Saddam saw an opportunity that Iran was in turmoil, and okay, now I can, say to hell with the Algiers agreement, I want to get Al-Ahwaz and I'll do this and so on. Yes, he did. However, Saddam was also frightened. He was frightened that they want to be, they said, and even people like Bani Sadr, we have to take our revolution beyond our borders. I mean, if Iran thinks that other countries are just
and US want to
go
beyond of their border.
No, but
Israel want to go beyond of their
excuse
border.
me, the point.
And Saudi Arabia attacked Yemen.
Absolutely, but you don't have to say Saudi Arabia attacked Yemen, 40 years after the Iranian Revolution. Stuff that Iran unleashed certain things in the region. This is a fact. They have to accept that. But the other thing is, why Iran should be more interested in the case of how the Arabs and the Israelis settle their dispute than Arabs are. I mean, Jordan, for example, or Syria, they are living on the border with Israel. They have fought Israel for several times, This is their definition of what is Iran's interest. I am absolutely against it. The hardliners, frankly, don't give a damn for Iran. They are on a sort of an Islamist utopia they want to go. Ayatollah Khamenei acts like a latter-day caliph, sits in there and everybody else sits a little bit lower. It is amazing how he does that. He sits on a high chair and others sit on the floor. And people come and recite poetry. It looks like you are in the court of Saljuk or really, whatever. And he calls himself Amir al-Mu'minin. So he doesn't care about Iran. I told him in front of everybody. That's why they don't ask me anymore. In front of Zarif and others, I said, you are using Iran as a headquarters, and you don't care for Iran. Now, obviously, Israel and others are going to do what they can. You can't just constantly say Israel should disappear and expect him not to do anything, or you have to constantly say that Arab monarchies are this and so on. Even with Saudi Arabia, they started out. It's not. Unfortunately, I have to say that. Again, Saudis have their own ambitions, but Iran has provided opportunities for them. Okay.
Unfortunately, I think we're going to have to
What?
take the other questions privately because
Okay.
Dr. Hunter has graciously agreed to sign copies of her
Yes.
book, which is available in the back. And
You need the
so in I think 15 minutes we need the book.
Okay, sure.
So 15
Absolutely.
minutes. So
Well,
But
can
you
I
will
just
say-
take one more question? If you have, we still have 5
Yes,
minutes.
really good question.
Very, very, very. Okay, this young lady there, and then we can talk afterwards. Yes.
Sure, thank you so much. Thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation, the lecture that you have. Your answer actually made me think about with the wealth of knowledge and experience that you have. I would love to hear your opinion about how you foresee the near future of Iran, considering that it's really the morality is under question now. How do you foresee that?
Well, I cannot. Only the answer is very shortly that I'm an analyst and I'm not a clairvoyant. But no, I'm not a clairvoyant, unfortunately. But I am concerned about the future of Iran, very much so.
But definitely read her book and you'll learn some
I can't wait. Yes,
Yeah.
I know.
Not just this, but the other one. But I
just
can
think
talk
that-
to you, young lady.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Kamara, again, for doing this.